welcome back to another video. This week I'm providing another update on Pony. For those who are not following along, this is my project pony. His name is Pony, and he'd been coming along so nicely last fall, but we took a few months off over the winter because of the weather. I had his wolf teeth removed during that time off, and when I brought him back to work this spring, something just wasn't right. So, to cut a long story short, and if you want the long story, go watch my last video, I'd found he'd had sharp fragments of his wolf teeth left behind. So, in my last video, we just worked on walk trot in my small dry lot, and I had really only just begun introducing the canter back. And in the weeks following, I've spent some time working with him on his ground manners. A few weird quirks that he'd had after the fragments appeared. He did not like having the halter pulled on over his ears, which still baffles me, even though I now know the cause, just because he never objected to having the bridle and the bit put on. But whatever. He became extremely fearful of the spray bottle out of his right eye and also having the hose used on his right side of his body. So, fly spraying and hosing after a ride was tricky. But he's really turned a corner on all of these things now. I've been like picking his feet out regularly with no problems, hosing him after my rides. I haven't really had any issues with the halter going on over his ears. And the biggest win for me is that I can fly spray him while he's still cross-tied without fearing that he would have an accident. He cross-ties really nicely, but I never want to do anything a horse is terribly uncomfortable with in the cross ties because you never want them to pull back and break it and learn that that's a thing. So I still think he requires tactful fly spray application and tactful hosing. Everything else I would say you can almost do tactlessly at this point. But I still move slow and cautiously, and overall, everything he's done has been a huge improvement. The biggest hurdle for us has probably been his canter. My sand arena is in a busy part of my property, so you can see the road, you can see all the activity at my house, anyone coming down the driveway, cars going down the street, and it's not a busy street, but in comparison, my dry lot or even my backfield are very sheltered. So the added reactivity from the tooth pain made Pony very, very spooky in my sand ring. When I tried to canter in that ring, it almost never went well, especially before I figured out what was going on with his tooth. And eventually, even trotting in that ring was very scary for Pony too. So when I was finally bringing him back to work after the tooth extraction, I was like, you know what? I am going to wait until we feel very confident in the small dry lot ring where it's a little bit more sheltered, a little bit less scaried. And also, it's where I turn Pony out most of the time because he doesn't really need a whole lot of grass. He's a fat little boy. So it just seemed like a good place to start until I reestablished his level headedness. But after my last video, I felt like I had made enough progress in the small ring that I was ready to at least add walk trot back in my sand ring. I did not film my first ride back in the big ring, but basically I trot around in my small arena, then moved down to the sand ring for his walk breaks. And like, you know, he started out tense in that big ring like I expected him to be, but I kept riding in there. I felt like I did a lot of walk and trot transitions and made it very clear that I didn't want him to go fast. I just wanted him to stretch down and relax. And he started out tense, but by the end of both rides, I was really able to have Pony softening over his back, relaxed, and moving nicely in both the walk and the trot, and really just not as spooky. One thing I will say, and I don't want to be misleading with the way I cut these videos because he does look quite relaxed and supple here, but our rides in the big arena were starting tense every time. But I felt good about how they were ending and that each ride he was a little bit less tense. So then I decided to move back into the small arena to check on how the canter work was going. So I think that for where we were at, these walk, trot, canter rides in the dry lot went pretty well. The canter wasn't great. There were a few times that we picked up the wrong lead and it was a little bit quick, but any canter transition that wasn't explosive, and I guess what I mean by explosive is he was doing a lot of just like grabbing the bit and running, or even sometimes picking up the wrong lead and bucking to change to his correct lead. So those were like the explosive behavior that I would see from him before I had the tooth removed. And so I wasn't like, I wasn't that bothered by the wrong leads because they weren't explosive. And I know I can fix his leads. I just wanted to get his head straight again, and I just wanted to make sure that he was relaxed. So I'm going to say these walk, trot, canter rides were fine. But because I'm looking at these videos with the power of hindsight, I probably shouldn't have graduated Pony to doing this canter work in the big ring as quickly as I did. So the next ride, I moved to the big ring where I was planning to add back the canter. And looking back on these videos, he and I were both actually just very tense the entire ride. I think for me, I was nervous and I maybe didn't anticipate that I would be nervous because I don't think I've ever felt close to falling off of Pony during his wild canter transitions. But I am a weenie at heart. And a lot of my training methodology centers around preparing my horses and avoiding tense and explosive rides because, I don't want to ride them through it. I want to make sure that they feel confident and it doesn't happen. But just for some reason, I'd like gotten it into my head that I needed to canter during these rides. And Pony is sensitive enough to pick up on my weird energy. And he knew I was going to ask for that canter, and that made him tense too. Really, the result was a full ride where we weren't doing each other any favors. I was tense, he was tense, and I was adding to his anxiety when I should have been helping him. And I know better, so I don't know why I rode that way on this day, but I felt like I was just sitting up there, in a tight little ball and pushing him forward, but also holding him back and being like, "Why won't you relax?" And obviously, why? How could he in that circumstance? So for me, this ride was just yuck. And you can probably see, especially if you compare it to my other videos where he was relaxed and working softly over his back. He's just so tight in here. And the canter wasn't really that bad. He was just grabbing the bit and hollowing out over his back, but it felt wild and it felt like I had no brakes. And unfortunately, my pivot died. So it didn't film what I thought was the worst transitions. And of course, the gas propane delivery guy showed up in the middle of the ride and really should have called it a day at that point. But I was like, I'm going to try again. And so it just wasn't good. And the next day, I didn't take any videos, but I did pretty much the same thing, I'm thinking. And the canter was just as bad. And so after that, I gave Pony a few days off and figured we'd both need a mental reset. Now, for whatever reason, I did not watch these videos back at the time. And I think if I did, maybe I would have been like, well, there's my problem. He's too tense, and I need to make sure that he isn't so tense. But I had to travel out of town. Pony sat for a few days, and then my next ride back was in a clinic where I wasn't even planning to ride him. I was planning to ride my standard-bred cricket. But I had to scratch him at the last minute due to an injury, so I subbed Pony in. And it was on my farm, but I was so anxious after my last ride on Pony went so poorly, and I just didn't feel like the canter was in a good place. So I had said to Lisa, my instructor who came down, that I didn't want a canter, I just wanted to do walk and trot. Because also, with the clinic being on my farm, there's a whole lot of trailers and horses coming and going, and I was like, this just isn't the right time after a week off to be working the canter. But my instructor, Lisa, was the person who I rode with for years when I lived in Connecticut, and I was very happy to be reunited with someone who knows me and my riding style so well. And she actually had me figured out almost immediately. She had me focus on keeping Pony in a relaxed and low frame to keep him thinking and bending and changing activities. She also had me do a long warm up in the walk where we did our lateral movements and worked on getting him moving off of my legs and controlling the shoulder. Anyways, the right lead canter in particular had been bad, and she convinced me to do the left lead before this, and it was really good. So I didn't want to do the right lead. I was like, let's end on a good note. The right's been the bad one, blah, blah, blah. But she thought I should. And the most impactful advice she gave me during this ride was to just keep it quiet. And I have a habit of revving my horses up and then asking them to canter when they're in a really forward trot, which is a bad habit I've picked up from my love of my lazy horses. But Pony's not lazy, and he's a little sensitive. So to rev him up while he's also anxious was just pushing him over the edge. And she said, keep it quiet, ask quietly, and if you didn't canter, deal with it then, rather than trying to predict that he was going to be slow and jazz him up before. Anyways, very simple advice, and it's made all the difference. The canter's been quite good ever since. So we'll skip ahead to my next and most recent ride by myself at home. I did a long warm up where I was trying to emulate what I did at the clinic, where I worked on leg yielding and moving the outside shoulder into more of a shoulder 4 to have him respecting both my inside leg and outside rein. And it was just already even better than my previous ride at the clinic, especially the leg yields. He was just moving nicely off of the legs, and I was very happy with him. Then, once those feel good, I decided to move on to trotting. He's feeling really good and relaxed in his trot work, and right as I felt like I might be ready to canter, my farm help showed up to muck paddocks. So I stopped mid ride to talk to her, and after that, I just wasn't sure if he'd be ready to canter. Again, the activity on the farm, and we'd just been standing around chit chatting. But when I did start trotting again, he felt probably more relaxed than he had during our warm up trot. And he did kind of tighten up and tense whenever he heard the muck cart like banging around behind him. But that actually made me feel pretty good about where Pony was at in his training, because I could just ask him to soften back into the contact and focus on me. And even with the outside distractions, I felt like I could ask for the canter safely. I put my pivo in a bad location for this ride because once I started going faster, it just lost me a few times. But I really focused on keeping his pace slow and steady and asking him to canter from a slow trot without jazzing him up first. And he stepped into a pretty nice canter. I think he eventually softened into a nice frame and connection, but that was after the pivo lost me. But whatever, I got a really good improvement in performance because after I asked him to canter, he was not tense afterwards either. And in my really bad rides, it was like I would canter and then he would just ball up into a very tight, nervous horse. So I changed directions and I did a few 3-looped serpentines, and then I worked on spiraling out and spiraling in on a 20-meter circle to kind of get the shoulder in front of me, focus on getting the correct lead. And once I felt him soften and relax, I asked for a canter transition again, focusing on not letting him run into it. I don't think this transition was nearly as relaxed as his left lead, but he did immediately soften and he did not grab the bit or run. He just felt like he put some oomph into the initial transition. And when I asked him to come back, he came back right away. So then it was nice for me because I could think and I thought about my own position. I sat back in the saddle rather than tipping forward. And then I asked him to soften into the canter and he was going really nicely. And then the pivo lost me. But I know it was a good canter. So you'll just have to trust me. Anyways, overall, I think that Pony has started to turn the corner. Every ride has led to a massive improvement, especially since my lesson in the clinic. And right now, I just think he requires a tactful rider and tactful handling on the ground still, but overall getting back to normal. However, I would love it if he continued to improve, and I feel like he'd be able to handle like a tactless or rider, or just maybe take a joke. So that's something we'll be working on to see if I can kind of keep working on bringing him back and getting him more comfortable under saddle again. So I hope you found today's update interesting. If you liked it, be sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more pony updates. Thanks for watching.